just because till the time audience joins in, I would like to know more about you, Angela.
Mhm.
How long you have been in this business? What's your journey starting as a conveyancer?
Well, I kind of have a bit of an interesting backstory, which I know Harshit knows a little bit about this already. But I started out fresh out of high school. I originally got into law. That was my passion. I wanted to follow law, but I was not quite 18 at the time, so I decided to defer it for a year and started working in a law firm. Decided very quickly I didn't like the lifestyle of that sort of business, because as well as being a conveyancer, I'm also a ballroom dancer. So I wanted to still be able to pursue that in my downtime as well, and I'm glad I did, because eventually an opportunity came up to buy a dance studio, and I spent about 5 or 6 years as a professional dancer here in Australia and overseas as well. And then I came back to conveyancing about 5 years ago. So
Wow.
started my own business, and that's where I am now. So
What an interesting journey. And you made other people dance now, and now it's more about very structured. Convincing is all about, follow the books. So the creativity also gets that's a very creative field, and this is more of a glued to your system. So how are you finding, which life do you enjoy more?
I mean, I enjoy them both. I mean, the creativity of the dancing is great, but the other thing is that, ballroom dancing is also very disciplined. It's very regimented. Like there's a lot of, it's not just kind of go outside and do your own thing. So it's kind of similar to conveyancing in that, there's still a structure to follow. There's still, sort of some rules and boundaries. So that kind of fits in with the conveyancing a little bit more. And
Wow. Yeah.
I can get a little bit creative when I'm drafting contract conditions too. Just depends on the scenario.
And are you saying that your clients get your dancing lessons for free?
Well, you'd be surprised how many people I have serviced both doing dancing and conveyancing.
Wow. And that's quite creative. And this field, convincing, So, uh, one thing that I'm always keen on, like, what are the things here? So, there are a lot of mistakes people are making related to property contracts and everything. And
Yeah.
that's where, what are the things how can we avoid them?
Well, I think you're never going to avoid 100% of mistakes. There's always going to be a little bit of human error involved, especially when, you never know who you're buying from. You never know who you're selling to. It's all a very personal journey, especially, residential property. So, people are buying a house to upgrade or they're selling a house to downsize. So everybody's circumstances are different. So sometimes people are, I guess, they just need to obviously make sure that whatever their intentions are properly reported in the contract so that you can avoid things like, mistakes or confusion later on. And look, the other thing is in this area of law, the parties want to get along. It's not like, traditional law where everyone's fighting in court. People want to get along. They want to do the deal. They want it to work out. They want a positive outcome. So they can sometimes fall into this sort of, being a bit too casual sometimes about the
Mhm.
contract. Everyone's happy enough with the deal that everything's told into enough detail. So that can catch people out a little bit. So and from
Wow.
a buyer's perspective as well, like, I mean, you guys would know this too, just there's so much in a contract that, it's very hard to kind of decipher if you're not involved in it from a day-to-day basis. So definitely making sure you get someone to look over that before you even enter a contract is super important, because once it's signed, there's not really much we can do about it.
Yep. And that's where the question that I got for previously, it's like, why do I need a conveyancer? Why can't I do it myself? Why can't conveyancing be DIY?
Well, I think it's like anything. I mean, you could do something yourself, but I'm not a builder, so I'm not going to try and do my own renovation work. I'm not a dentist. I'm not going to try and do my own dental work. At the end of the day, it's exactly the same as any industry. You take your car to a mechanic when you need to get it fixed. I mean, it's possible to fix it yourself, but there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And if you lack the skills and the experience, sometimes it can actually cost you more to try and do it yourself because you're not aware of what you need to be doing. And, I suppose we're not talking about, something like a car or, going to the doctor. We're talking about, multi-million-dollar purchases in some instances. So we're talking about like big life-changing decisions that people are making. You definitely need to leave it in the hands of the professionals.
Yep, I agree, and that's quite interesting. So, yes, conveyancer, we understand, we hear a lot of word as settlement, right? For a common man, what happens at the settlement? And do I need to attend it myself? Because this is the question from one of my audience.
Yeah, so I get that question a lot as well, because that has actually changed a lot over the years. When I first started doing conveyancing, you would physically have to go somewhere and you would have to exchange. If you were the seller, you would have to bring all the signed transfer documents and the title deed, and you would exchange it for bank checks. So there would be a physical exchange of documents and money, usually somewhere in the city. And that sort of happened years ago, but now it's all electronic. So settlement now is a direct electronic transfer of title from one person to the other, and at the same time, simultaneous funds transfer, but it's all done electronically. So there's actually no physical attendance anymore.
Can you trust that online transfer and everything? And I've heard a word as PEXA as well, because I have a question, separate related question from one of my client. What is PEXA? They hear it a lot.
Mm. So PEXA is an acronym. It's an acronym short for Property Exchange Australia. So it's the online workspaces that we all use now to facilitate the settlements. So it's a direct conduit into the land titles office. So it has a direct link in, so it can make instant changes to a title or to ownership. And it's also attached to the Reserve Bank of Australia. So any monetary transactions go in and out through the Reserve Bank. So it's obviously backed and guaranteed by the Australian government. So it's in some ways it's probably a little bit more safe and secure than doing paper and bank checks. We used to, I mean, not in my experience so much, but there was definitely a lot of issues of bank checks bouncing, or fraudulent documents and title deeds and that sort of thing. So I think the online space kind of makes that process a lot more immediate and streamlined. So there's not as much time delay and for things to go wrong.
Wow. So as you said that they moved from manual to electronic, and the PEXA is the tool that you guys use, right? For every
Yeah,
stage.
yeah. So essentially,
Fantastic.
it's a website that we log into, and we create a workspace for our particular file. If it's a sale, for example, I'll be invited in there to represent the seller. The purchaser's conveyancer is invited to represent them. If we have a bank, an incoming or an outgoing bank, they're invited. So everyone works in the same workspace. We prepare all the documents in there. We do all the adjustments and the finances in there as well. So it's also kind of streamlined it so that you've got one central place to connect to everything that you need to, rather than having to go to 3 or 4 different places just to facilitate one settlement.
So for the clients, for purchaser or seller, they don't need to worry about all these jargons. That's where conveyancer comes in. You guys, that's your tool. That's what you use to get things sorted at your back.
Yeah, correct. And the clients actually, I think it's unfortunate because clients, brokers, even you guys as buyer agents and other vendor agents, anyone that's involved in the process, you don't actually get to see PEXA in action. It's only yeah, it's literally only conveyancers and lawyers that have visibility over PEXA. So it's sort of like it's a bit of a mystery at the moment. People are still a little bit, what is this mysterious PEXA, that we hear so much about.
Oh wow! No, that's quite interesting. And you know what? It's always about. So when everything is online, you guys have a standard tool. It's all automated. Or do you see hidden contract clauses as well?
Oh, you're always going to find hidden contract clauses. It's one of my favorite things. Sometimes my colleagues refer to me as a bit of a bloodhound. I tend to be able to sniff out some dodgy clauses pretty quickly. There's a few of them around. From a buyer's perspective, you've always got to look out for additional hidden fees. A lot of conveyancers that act for sellers like to try and charge the buyer for lots of different things. So, for example, if your contract is subject to finance and you need an extension, sometimes they propose to charge you a fee to request an extension of a finance clause. So there's lots of those sorts of things. I think there's also a few extra fees if you want to reschedule a settlement, like bring it earlier, which is if you're defaulting, that's one thing. But I think if you're doing something that's mutually beneficial for both parties, that the buyer shouldn't have to pay for that. And then there's probably more so just a few clauses in there that people just a little bit, people don't kind of understand. A lot of people have heard of like the cooling off period. A lot of people lot of people don't realize that there's actually a penalty if you cool off. You actually have to pay some money to cool off. So it's
Is it
equal to
state-wise, or is it for type of an asset, or state-wise, or how does it work?
the penalty.
Yep.
Yeah, so the penalty for cooling off in Victoria, it's 0.2% of the price of the property. So on an average value property, it could be around $1,000 to $1,200.
Interesting.
So,
I wasn't aware of.
yeah,
And
and the other thing people aren't aware of all the time with cooling off periods is you're not always guaranteed to get it if you buy at an auction, or if you buy after it's been passed in at auction, or if you take it off the market a couple of days beforehand, you don't get a cooling off period at all. And if you're a company, so if you're buying like as a corporate entity or a self-managed super fund, you also don't get the cooling off period.
interesting. And is it a separate rule for residential and commercial in cooling off?
Not so much commercial, like agricultural land is
Mhm.
exempt. You don't get a cooling off for that. I think it's just situations where the buyer ending the contract sort of flippantly, it's going to cause a much bigger upset than just your average residential property. So I guess they're also assuming that if you're a corporate entity, that you have a little bit more understanding of the legally binding nature of a contract, so you're not as likely to need to pull out of the contract.
Quite interesting. And to be honest, as a buyer or seller, we don't come across, because our conveyancer professionals like you take care of everything in the back end, whether it's a hidden clause or whatever. You bring that transparency in the entire deal and make it a pleasant experience for the clients, right?
Yeah, that's our aim, obviously, is to try and minimize the disappointment that people might experience if they don't fully understand, what they're getting themselves into. Um, when you talked about hidden clauses before, and us in the background, something else I was thinking of actually is the building and pest inspection clauses. That's
All
definitely
right.
definitely, like, most people know that I can buy a property and it can be subject to a building and pest inspection, but what people don't realize is that it's only if you find major defects in the report that you have any rights under the contract. If you find lots of minor defects, you don't actually have any legal rights under the contract whatsoever. So that can catch a lot of people out, because cumulatively lots of little things that are wrong with the property can really add up. So it's definitely worthwhile going in there and making sure you either know what you're getting yourself into, or potentially I like to suggest to my clients to have extra conditions in their contract so that they can have some rights if there are minor defects that add up to a certain amount. So just those sorts of people are not always aware of the wording of the contract as well.
Yeah, and I got a question just on that. Any tips on how to avoid the legal fee for cooling off? Maybe use the finance condition to come out? Any pitfalls in that?
If you look, finance is a hard one, because again, in the finance condition, you do have to act honestly. You do have to apply for the loan. You do have to do everything in your power. And if the vendor suspects that you're not being honest, they can actually requisition your documents from your loan application to prove that you've actually applied for the loan and that you've done everything reasonably necessary to get that loan. So it's probably not something I would advise using to get out of a contract. If someone's uncertain about it and they want to maybe have time to think about it, it is possible to add a special condition where you can make it, conditional on some kind of additional due diligence. And that way it takes it away from the cooling off. I had a client buy a property sight unseen, and she wanted to put in the contract that she had the right to inspect that property and could decide for any reason whatsoever to terminate that contract within that 3 business days, but she got 5 days. And that was agreed to as a special condition. So it is possible, but I definitely don't recommend, trying to use some of the other conditions in that way, just because you might get caught out.
Yeah, because the hot markets as a buyer's agent where we are buying, if you put too many conditions, that doesn't make sense for us. That deal doesn't become that lucrative for us to win for our client. See, one thing you mentioned about PEXA, we spoke about some hidden contract clauses, some conditions, what can go wrong, how to save money. Can you just, how the convincing process works? Can you simplify that for our audience?
Yeah, look. So, I mean, from the seller's perspective and the buyer's perspective, there's the workflow is kind of different. So, for the seller, a bulk of the work is actually done before the property's even sold. So, the seller's job in the first instance, and our job as the conveyancer, is to work on disclosure. So, we have to go through the property, we have to go through a whole lot of a list of things that they need to comply with, and we prepare the documents from that. So once the property is sold, the process is the same as purchasing a property. We have to prepare stamp duty forms. We have to prepare the transfers. Every participant or every person involved has to be formally identified. So we have to do a proper verification of everybody's identity. And then we obviously prepare any other necessary documents that, depending on the situation. For example, if it's a new property, we might have to collect some GST. If it's a foreign person selling a property, we might have to collect some foreign gains capital tax, that sort of thing. Just really depends on the situation. And then, we book in the settlement with everybody and finalise all the figures. So it's sort of it's a pretty straightforward process when I talk about it like that, but it's actually a lot more involved.
I have got a question. It's about, is there any way to terminate the contract if there is 66W in contract?
Sorry, say that again.
Is there any way to terminate the contract if there is 66W in contract? I don't know what. We need some detail on that.
Yeah, I probably need a little more clarification.
Yeah, so no problem. I'll connect you with this individual, and then you can, so to my audiences, you guys can have, it's a specific query, it seems like, of some clause in a contract. So I'll share your details, Angela, in the on our Facebook page, and people can reach out to you directly online, right? So that way. And there is another question. Just a second. Will the conveyancer apprise about heritage status and potential issues in contract before signing, or do we also need solicitors to be safe?
Well, solicitors and conveyancers do the same job when it comes to conveyancing. So if you're talking about heritage listing, that's something that the vendor has to disclose. So provided they have disclosed it, it's definitely something that we would bring up with them. We would probably also refer them to the local council planning scheme, which would set out what that heritage overlay was and how it affects the property, whether it's going to affect things like development, the facade, or whether it's just a protected area. So it would definitely be something that we would bring up with the buyer beforehand and raise with them, provided it's been disclosed.
That's quite interesting. See, we talked about hidden clauses, processes, and some specific questions from our audience. Are there any new regulations? Because things are changing all the time. So is there anything new in Victoria which our audience should be aware of, buyers or sellers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not actually that new, but I suppose it depends on how long it's been since you've bought or sold a property. Some people, might have been 10 years or more. But probably one of the biggest changes is to do with buildings and renovations. And I actually talk about this quite a lot is usually it's only, or people believe that it's only if you've done, got building permits for, big works that you need to disclose that. But even if you've just done a cosmetic renovation of your bathroom or your kitchen, you do need to disclose that, and you now need to have a report filed on the renovation so that the purchaser can be fully appraised of what you've done. And if there's any defects, sometimes you also need insurance if it's been like a large scale renovation. And if you don't, as a seller, if you don't provide those reports and insurance at the time you're required to, the buyer can actually terminate the contract and walk away without penalty at any time. So it's a very big thing. And as the buyer, definitely being aware of that when you look at a property, and if you see that it's been renovated or it's been advertised as being renovated, it's also about being educated to ask that question to the agent and check that up yourself to make sure that those documents have been included, because they won't be covered by normal insurance if something goes wrong.
So, Angela, are the selling agents apprising the buyer about those, or it is something a conveyancer needs to figure out and inform both the parties that this is what needs to be done? Because it's all about awareness.
Correct. And look, the responsibility is on the owner. So it's on the owner to know that, but the estate agent should be directing them to the conveyancer, or at least, you know, having some, I guess, knowledge of what it is. But when it comes to the disclosure, that's to the conveyancer. So if the real estate agent meets with the client and they know that they've done some renovation work, it should be a question, say, oh, have you spoken to a conveyancer about any reports or insurance that you might need?
Wow. And are you seeing a lot of issues in the first home or the investor? Are there different rules in the way you look at the property or the contract as well, whether it's an investor or a home buyer or a first home buyer? Does that make any changes the way you look at the contract?
It definitely does. There are 100% some standard things that we look at in every contract and every document, no matter who you are or, you know, what you're doing. But then obviously we will tailor a lot of our pre-purchase advice towards what you're doing. So, for example, if I have a client who has plans to, you know, subdivide the property in the future, I'll definitely do a lot more investigation on, you know, not just in the contract, but I'll actually research and have a look at some of the planning controls to make sure that, you know, their proposed plan for the property after settlement is going to be viable. You know, they might also be looking at, you know, maybe not just investing in the property, maybe they're looking at renovating it themselves, or maybe they're looking at extending, you know, and they want to know whether or not they can bulldoze it and put 2 townhouses, those sorts of things. If they're a first home buyer and they just don't know anything about the property, we'll just tend to kind of go with whatever we find and what we can see and what's available. So, but yeah, it definitely changes what we look at when we're investigating a property.
And from convincing perspective, do you deal in commercial properties as well?
Yes, we do. Yes.
And do you find residential versus commercial, which is more complicated from clause rules perspective? And based on your experience, can you share any story about clients, you know, a residential and a commercial client as well, where you have to pitch in as a conveyancer and sort things out, whether it's clauses or something they didn't understand,
Yeah.
how you got the deal done?
There's actually not technically any difference between commercial property and residential property. They have the same disclosure requirements as each other. The contracts are the same. The only additional things that we look at with commercial properties is we obviously have to look at things like GST, because people are carrying on an enterprise, they're carrying on as a business. You can't live in a commercial property, so we're not looking at any of those sorts of things when we're buying. We're looking at, you know, what the property can be used for. We're paying more attention to, you know, if they're planning to run a business, whether that's permitted by town planning and whether they need to get, you know, the best example for that would be my own dance studio. We took out a commercial space, and you can't run a dance studio in an industrial zone. So we did the research on that beforehand and made all of our deals subject to town planning permits, because we knew that we needed to have council permission to run a dance studio in an industrial zone. So that was definitely something where my expertise came in handy for my other business. And with residential properties, it's really just knowing what all the rules are. You know, things like body corporate. I think that's probably another thing where we can get things done a bit better. Is a lot of people don't really understand the rules about body corporate. So I helped a client actually just the other day, got her in touch with someone who helped her actually put together her body corporate correctly, so that they could put together all the correct sale documents, and they're going to continue on with that person as a consultant in the future to continue to help them with, you know, managing their body corporates privately rather than outsourcing. So yeah, it just depends on the situation.
And similarly, today, if we see as a buyer, we are seeing a lot of people are buying under SMSF, under super, whether it's commercial or residential for investment.
Yeah.
So are there specific rules or clauses for SMSF property, or they all are catered under commercial or residential? There's nothing else. SMSF doesn't put any extra clauses on that.
So there's nothing specific that you need to do in terms of the contract. There's no additional disclosure requirements from the seller's perspective and from the buyer's perspective. The only thing I will say from a buyer's perspective is it's probably always advisable to have your structure for your self-managed super fund set up in advance of signing any contracts. Nominating under a contract, that's a whole, I mean, obviously that kind of goes off onto another tangent, but if you buy a contract in one name and you then try and nominate to somebody else, there can be some stamp duty issues. We generally, if it's your own company or if it's your own super fund, we usually don't find too many issues, but it's definitely better to have that structure in advance. So probably, making sure that the contract has the correct entity named in the contract, because you would be familiar with this as well, that there's rules for super funds borrowing money. So there's a whole different layer of structuring that people need to go through for that as well. So that's definitely something to be aware of when you're buying under FMSF, regardless of whether it's commercial or residential.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's quite insightful. And another thing is a question from one of our audiences: how important is title insurance when buying a new property?
So title insurance it's actually more of an American thing than it is here in Australia. We offer it as additional, additional coverage, just to sort of cover you from things that can go wrong or could go wrong. But in Australia, we have a very clean title registration system. It's very well documented and it's very reliable. Over in the United States, they don't have those sorts of title, registration systems in place. So quite often titles can be in doubt or ownership could be in doubt. People don't know where their, connections are. People are not sure about buildings. We have a lot more strict rules here in Australia. So we don't have as many people taking out title insurance, but I still always recommend it for anyone buying a property, whether it's a new property or an old property. I think for the investment, you can never be too careful, and there are definitely things that regular insurance companies will always try and avoid. So I think it's a small price to pay for that extra peace of mind.
Have you ever encountered a title search uncovered something unexpected?
All the time.
Oh my God! And how you helped your client navigate it?
Well, I'm in the process of doing something pretty sticky at the moment. I had a client who sold a property. Well, my client actually bought the property from their son. It was an investment property, and they bought it from them. And it was an apartment, and it had two separate accessory titles, one for a car park and one for a storage unit. And the previous conveyancer never picked up the other two titles, so they only transferred one title. And that was 10 years ago. And the really lucky thing for my client is that they obviously know the person that they bought the property from. So we're now able to go through the process of rectifying it. It's been about 3 months and we're almost at the end of that process. So I've done one previously where a similar situation happened, but we were unable to contact the people that the client bought the property from. So we ended up having to do a what do they call it? I've gone blank on the word now. We had adverse possession. We had to go through and do an adverse possession.
Okay.
Yeah, to get the titles transferred over to them. So those sorts of things can be a bit tricky when you do a title search and you realize that something's missing.
Wow. And that brings me handling unique cases. So what's most challenging property transaction that you have faced? Because I would like to hear that story, because that's great for our audience, so that you should not do that, or we should not be in that situation ever.
Oh, most challenging one. I think I've had quite a few challenging ones for different reasons. I'm not sure how it happened, but I tend to be a bit of a magnet for these sorts of files. A lot of my colleagues, other conveyancers and lawyers, they tend to send me a lot of these files because I tend to be a bit of a problem solver. Recently we had a self-managed super fund that was put together about 25 years ago, so well before my time. And the way it was put together and how it was all structured was completely wrong. And we were looking at the client potentially having to pay double stamp duty to transfer it back to their super fund. And we worked with a tax lawyer to help us prove ownership or correct ownership of that property to the super fund. And we were able to actually claim a full exemption on stamp duty for that to make sure it got transferred back to the correct entity. So that was we had to bring in tax experts to help us, put together our application, because it went back 25 years, and it involved obviously we can't give tax advice, so we have to make sure that we've got other consultants with us to help provide any other documents we need to get these sorts of things across the line. So that took probably about 12 months to get through. So that was a pretty big one.
My God. And it's crazy. Never heard of something like that. But yeah, you get all those stuff. But one thing is about negotiating terms. What kind of contract clauses can be negotiated in Victoria? And how do you help clients to get the best terms?
So pretty much everything is negotiable in a contract as long as it doesn't contravene any of the rights given to either the seller or the buyer by law. So, for example, like cooling off period, you can't agree in a contract to waive a cooling off period. That's against the law to do that. So, but as long as it's not contradicting any of those, you can agree to pretty much whatever you want to agree to. And I mean, you said before that sometimes putting lots of different conditions in contracts doesn't make it as appealing when you're making an offer. And that can be true. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword because, you know, as the buyer, more conditions protect you, give you more rights, you know, and that's what you want for your client. But it can also be very, you know, off-putting for the seller to have so many conditions. So a lot of buyers tend to have a bit of fear of missing out. So they tend to feel, you know, pressured into, you know, going into contracts with less conditions. But the main thing is just having the confidence to go in and negotiate. And, you know, I definitely recommend always, if a buyer is unsure about how to negotiate or they're not confident in their negotiating skills, this is where they need to be speaking to a buyer agent, because the seller's agent represents the seller. It's a very one-sided negotiation if you don't have someone on your side. So unless you're working with your conveyancer, they really feel like they're a bit out of their depth sometimes. So definitely understanding, you know, that you can negotiate is definitely the best thing. But you can also offset to make it more appealing to a vendor. So you can offer them a higher deposit, for example, in exchange for, you know, more terms, or maybe you can offer them a slightly higher price, or, you know, a shorter settlement period. So you can offset some of the conditions that you want to ask for, and you can then offer the seller something a bit more appealing as well to offset that. So that's definitely a way to go about it as well.
Quite interesting, and this is quite insightful. And what you mentioned about being on the seller side and the buyer side, we see day in, day out, being a buyer's agent, we know what's happening in the market, the way we represent our buyers. So yeah, it's quite competitive, and it's very easy to get swayed away what's being offered from the other side. So we are the ones who put a control. Hey, this seems too good to be true. Let's verify. Let's get the professionals. Let's conveyancer or the tax planners or the solicitors, or let's
Yeah.
verify. It's too good to be true. So another thing is, Angela, this all comes really well. You know, it's a package. Yes, once we engage in conveyancer, you have simplified it, what value you bring into the table, and few scenarios are quite insightful. But it all comes down to cost.
Yeah.
Are there any hidden fees with conveyancing as well? And how do you ensure transparency with conveyancing cost and prevent financial surprises for buyers and sellers in your profession?
So, yeah, so for me personally, we offer a set conveyancing fee, and that's usually based on the scope of work. So if we know in advance that we're acting just in a very standard, basic residential property conveyance, we can usually offer a standard fee for us. But then there's definitely things that people have to factor in that aren't charged by us, and they're not always things that you can know in advance. So as an example, if I'm representing a buyer, I will need to do some due diligence on the property, and there is a cost to that. I have to order, you know, title searches, or I have to order a water asset plan from the water authority. I might have to order some heritage, you know, documents, or if it's a property with a body corporate, I might have to order body corporate documents, which is an added cost. So those sorts of things we're not always able to estimate them 100% in advance, but usually we can estimate or give you a bit of a ballpark of what we think they're going to cost. And then there's obviously things like, you know, stamp duty. If you're going with title insurance, that's another cost to factor in. I wouldn't say that they're hidden costs. I think they're just things that people don't often think to ask about, because they're not things that we charge. So like titles office registration fees, they're quite expensive. And you could ask a broker what the rates are now, but lender's mortgage insurance is still a pretty big fee if you're borrowing more than 80%. So that's, yeah. So, and I think probably the thing to watch out for with conveyances is if the price seems too good to be true, it probably is, which means there's probably not everything included. What they might be offering could be just very basic process, for the conveyance. They might have to pay extra for certain things. They might have to pay extra for a contract review, or they might have to pay extra if there's, a licensing agreement that needs to come together, or, just if there's some kind of additional consideration, they might just charge extra for those things and not actually quote them up front.
So that means once you're in the contract, you're stuck now. You have to pay because they will just get you for a vanilla service. You're in, and then they will just inflate. Everything comes in the background without information. So yes, communication will be later. So it's about transparency, to be honest.
Yeah. And we're always as upfront as we possibly can be with the fees, because obviously our fee doesn't change unless something completely goes out of the ordinary, like this one that I was talking to you about earlier, the title, where there's 2 titles that are missing. That we've obviously had to revise our quote on the work because the scope has changed. So that was obviously something we had to go in and re-quote for the client because there's additional work. So we'll always quote that before we start any work.
Oh, I think as the conversation is getting interesting in some scenarios, I'm getting some interesting questions. There's a question,
okay.
How do you address easements and rights of way, assuming there are any easements or rights of way on the property that might restrict building or give others access through my land? Very specific question.
Yeah, so most easements are recorded on title, so you'll see them on a plan. For example, the most common one that we see is, sewerage or drainage easements, which are in favour of the council, and the council tries to keep them on the property boundary, so either the rear boundary or the side boundary, to keep it as far away from the usable land as possible. So they're pretty good with that, although, drainage and sewerage rely very heavily on gravity. So depending on where the property is located, if it's at the top of a hill or the bottom of a hill, sometimes the location of the easement might be undesirable. But generally you can't build any permanent structures over or within a certain distance of an easement, even if there's nothing laid under it. You probably need to get a permit. Things like a driveway might be okay because it's just a concrete driveway. But if you're planning on doing like a carport or you want to build a granny flat or something, you definitely have to be careful of building near an easement or over an easement because the other people have rights over that. So we would definitely look into that and bring that to the client's attention, especially if that was something they were looking at doing. If they were looking at a development in the future, we would definitely raise that with them if they had a proposal to do that.
Interesting. Another question is, for land and house and new builds, what are the things to understand?
There's lots of different ones, especially if it's off the plan. So a lot of people get caught out when they're buying a new property. If they buy even like a house and land package, when they first sign the contract, they might be told by the agent or the developer that they're expecting to be done in 3 months or 6 months. Always check for what's called a sunset date, because a sunset date is usually 18 months, sometimes can be up to 5 years, which means you have to be stuck in that contract maybe up to 5 years until the developer completes everything. So that's probably one of the biggest things that people aren't aware of. And that's not just for the new estates. There was a property in Baronia in the eastern suburbs here, just a 2-lot subdivision. And my client bought that off the plan thinking, the house is already built. We should be able to settle in 60 days. And when I looked at the contract, they didn't get it looked over beforehand. I told them it was an off-the-plan contract and they should be prepared to wait up to 18 months. And they said, no, we've been told that it's, 3 months away, so we'll get in 60 to 90 days. That one took nearly 6 months. So it definitely does happen.
Oh. These are the nuances that a normal person who is just buying is just going on what's being told. So it's all seller's market, right? So what they are trying to sell. Another question is, many times a settlement date, how many times a settlement date can be changed?
Well, the legal answer to that is that the contract settlement date is the contract settlement date. And realistically, it can be changed anytime, as long as both parties are in agreement. So if both parties agree to bring the settlement date earlier or later, they can do that, but both have to agree to do that. And in my opinion, you need to have a document, a deed of variation to evidence that, because it can get quite messy if somebody, doesn't meet the new settlement date. You want to be able to, have trigger dates for, penalties and those sorts of things from the correct settlement date.
That's
So
quite
realistically, you can change the settlement date as many times as you want. It's obviously not a great idea, but it can be changed, and especially if both parties are quite flexible, it can be moved. But yeah, again, it depends on the situation.
we all talk about good stories. You did mention some of the things, surprises as well. And when a contract goes sideways, how do you guide your clients through the dispute resolution process and help them stay calm?
So we get little minor disputes all the time. Sometimes people think they're getting something at settlement. Like for example, they go to the property at the final inspection and realise that the heater's not working, and the owner says, well, the heater was never working. That was always the case. The buyer thinks that they should fix it, but the vendor's not obligated to fix it, or there's a dispute about whether someone has to pay for this or that. The main thing is to work out not so much who's at fault. It doesn't really matter who's at fault at that point. It's really a case of how do we resolve it? What's the best way to resolve it and move forward so that both parties can obviously move on with the purchase of the property or the sale of the property, whichever way it is. Like I said, in this scenario, that's the end goal. People want that to happen. So it's more a case of, what is going to work for both parties, and, can we come to a viable agreement where everybody, can come to that agreement without the need for intervention higher than that, because the cost of court intervention is ridiculously high. So the more people can kind of work together to come to an outcome. I mean, that's our advice, obviously, is to obviously try and get the best outcome, but obviously try and avoid court intervention as well.
And you try to facilitate that conversation as well between the parties, or it becomes a buyer's agent's or a selling agent's job to get something?
No, so it's definitely the conveyancer's job. So we technically represent the seller or the buyer. So we're the person that we're the ones that have the authority to make that offer, or if somebody wants to raise a dispute, that's for us to deal with. I mean, for minor things, obviously agents can get involved just, on a small level to, I guess, to communicate things. But yeah, we would definitely speak to the other conveyancer, and we'd have a discussion about, what each party's preferred outcome is, and see where can we meet, where can we make it happen.
That's quite, I've got another question. Can there be a purchase where more than two parties are involved and multiple conveyancers are involved?
So like two people buying a property with individual conveyancers?
Yep.
Absolutely. Everybody has the right to be represented by whomever they like. It's obviously if it's a husband and wife buying together, it's usually they'll have the same conveyancer. But in if it's a development or a joint venture and you have two companies or two entities that want to be separately represented, that's totally fine.
Quite good. And any tips on body corporate related clauses to watch for?
Well, not so much in the contract, but body corporates in general. Just making sure that if they're active, if there is a body corporate that's listed on the title, there should be at least at the bare minimum details of insurance, and details of how active they are. Whether there are any issues with the body corporate, whether there's been any claims made, and just how the body corporate operates. Probably one of the biggest ones nowadays, probably since about 2019, is to also look at things like in big apartment buildings, things like the cladding. There's a lot of issues with apartment building cladding at the moment, and a lot of building notices are being ordered by council. So there's a lot of cost involved in that replacement. So that's definitely something that buyers should be looking at if they're buying an apartment, for example, just making sure that things like the cladding are actually compliant, otherwise they might be signing themselves up to take on a future debt.
So also there is one more question which came out. Any checks which are done on haunted property or crime scene at property in past? This is amazing.
Yeah, and do you know what? That's actually not a silly question at all. It is 100%. It is a material fact. So over the last couple of years, the consumer affairs checklist has been added to and updated over the years. But one thing that has always been there is the vendor does have to disclose whether somebody has died or been murdered at the premises. And that's something that a purchaser may be able to void the contract for if it's not disclosed, because especially for some cultures, they won't purchase a property if somebody's passed away in there. So that's it might sound silly, but there's definitely actually a legal requirement to disclose that. And if it we can do some checks. There's not obviously a register or somewhere that it's all that information is kept, but it's definitely something that we can investigate if somebody's concerned about it.
And I believe estate agents will also be able to inform the buyer about the property. That's what we expect them before they get in a
Yeah,
contract or anything, right?
yeah, the agent will have a copy of that material facts checklist, and they'll be able to provide it to the buyer. And if the buyer asks those questions or that sort of thing, then obviously the agent's compelled to either answer or get the vendor to provide that information.
Wow, that's quite insightful, Angela. I'm feeling like, oh, now it's quite good. So, Angela, we went through multiple nuances, contracts, situations, scenarios. And so, one of the things is there are so many conveyancers, right? There are so many, because as a buyer's agent, we deal with so many conveyancers. We have a referral partner channel wherein, there are so many. So, what's the key differentiator when they engage you in
Yeah.
their convincing journey? So that's what I would like to know.
So for me personally, I think my background and experience is definitely something that is it's a value add to my clients, because I've not just worked as a conveyancer in a conveyancing firm. I've worked as a conveyancer in law firms, which deal with very specific legal things. So my first experience was things like town planning. So I've got a very heavy background in things like town planning, development, all of that sort of stuff. I spent 3 years working for a solicitor who all he dealt with really was trusts and self-managed super funds. So I learned a lot about that from working with him, and just having that well-rounded experience with all different types of properties, commercial, residential, different structures, just understanding a lot more of the legal background, not just knowing the process. That's definitely what sets us apart when we represent our clients. And our clients definitely will see that value in the pre-purchase advice that they get, but then also as they go along the process, just some of the things that we can, I guess, manage for them before they even know that they're going to have a problem. Like, we're going to be able to find that. So that's definitely something that sets us apart from other conveyancers.
That's quite valuable, because that kind of an experience that helps definitely when things, when you need that level of expertise and things. So that's a different lens that you bring it apart from your convincing. I got one question. In commercial, what are the latest stamp duty laws for Victoria?
So this is a new one. So it's only just come in July this year. So they've introduced what's called the Commercial and Industrial Property Tax Reform. It's essentially going to eventually replace stamp duty. So a property has to enter the scheme first before it applies. So as an example, if somebody buys a commercial property now, they would still pay normal stamp duty upfront. There is a possibility that they could have that loan to them. The government can cover it and they can pay it back over time, but you're still paying that upfront fee. And then on the 10th anniversary of that property entering the scheme, that's when they start paying an annual property tax, which I believe is going to be about 1% of the value of the property per year.
Do you think it's beneficial for commercial investors, the new scheme?
I think it's one of those things where time will tell. I think it's probably too soon to know what that impact is going to be. I think we need to see the first generation of properties entering the scheme and then converting into the annual property tax to really determine whether or not it's going to have a cost impact. I think part of the push to do this was that commercial properties tend to not turn over as quickly as residential properties. So I think in terms of, the tax itself, it's probably a little bit better from the State Revenue Office's perspective. They're probably going to, or maybe they're anticipating that it's going to net them a greater tax benefit. So I think it'll take time to see whether or not it works for the owner, or whether it's not going to work.
So Angela,
Um,
sorry, Puru here. So my understanding was if the property is sold second time in its life as a freehold, then the tax is not there. But if it's being sold for the first time, then the buyer has to pay the stamp duty for commercial. Is that right?
So without knowing the specific circumstances, I would have to know whether did the property enter the scheme before it was sold the second time, and after what period of time was that?
So say it's a warehouse and it is sold first time after 1st of July when the new laws came in, and
Mm-hmm.
I bought the property. That is one scenario.
Yep.
And second scenario is it was sold earlier by the previous like by the first owner, then the second owner continued owning it and they are selling after 1st of July.
So I think this is probably a question I would need to answer specifically for you, because you would
Okay,
have to look at, yeah, you would have to definitely look at what date it first entered the scheme, because that's the trigger date. So
sure.
as far as the State Revenue Office is concerned, it's all about when it enters the scheme and then when it converts over into an annual property tax. So
Let
the
me
standard rule still applies.
yeah, I'll try to talk to you offline that because in
Yeah.
my understanding the rule was applying to the actual freehold rather than the ownership of the freehold, right?
So that's the freehold. Yeah. So ownership is freehold.
Okay.
that's quite specific, Puru, and that these things, and do you see, Angela, this domain of rules and regulations? Is it too dynamic in Victoria, or you're seeing other states as well doing the same? Because I do understand you do convincing for Victoria right
At the
now.
moment, yeah, at the moment,
Mhm.
I only do conveyancing in Victoria. I'm only licensed in Victoria. I have some minor experience with Queensland, New South Wales, and Western Australia as well. But I'm currently only licensed in Victoria. That might be a future plan down the track. But Victoria is definitely known as the tax state. we
Okay.
we have a lot. We have a lot of tax laws, and there's been quite a lot introduced over the last couple of years. Land tax laws have changed. This new commercial property tax law has changed. Lots of tax laws that have come in. We have this thing now on bigger properties that get rezoned called windfall gains tax. So when developers or people owned previously rural land that got redeveloped and rezoned for chopping up into smaller estates, and people had a massive windfall from going from a farm valued at X to then all of a sudden it's valued a lot more because a developer wants it. The government now taxes the windfall. So I don't think any other state has the same fluidity in their tax as what we do, but we definitely do have a lot of taxes here in Victoria.
That's interesting. And, anyways, we are at 5 minutes left now. So, Angela,
That went
are you planning to, how about the expansion? Because I heard that you're expanding, you're getting bigger in Victoria. So, would like to know what's your new business plan, how you can help our people with a bigger team, bigger presence, and what's your expansion plan for your business to help clients with your services?
Yeah, so at the moment, I can't go into too many specifics because we're still in the handover phase. But I'm going to be setting up a second office of my business in the northern suburbs, and taking on an existing business there. And the staff are going to stay on, so we're going to be able to basically just pick it up and keep running. So we'll be able to offer services to people in the northern suburbs, which we can already do now. We're not location based, where we can service any area in Victoria. But I think it does help to have a presence in different areas, just to kind of be seen and be local, especially with the other local businesses. We're always trying to be part of the greater community rather than just being in our own bubble. So we like to work with a lot of different referral partners, agents, brokers, those sorts of people, just to see how we can help their clients. So yeah, we're going to be expanding into the north in the next couple of weeks. So that'll be very exciting.
Yeah, that's amazing, and that reflects as well the value add people are getting, the value you're adding to your clients. That's why business is also growing. And I'm more interested because we buy as a buyer's agent, we buy Australia wide. So we buy in every state. No, not every state. It's majorly Western Australia, Queensland, South Australia,
Yeah.
and slightly in Victoria. We are coming back in Victoria on some of the specific suburbs. So yes, that's there. But I'm looking forward for bigger partnership and see that how we can explore um, with your business growing interstate as well. Because for conveyances, there's always good to have local person because state laws are different. But that's the limitation of your business. But there's a lot of our clients are in Victoria, and there are a lot of clients who have invested interstate are planning to come back to Victoria as well. So we are seeing that trend now. But yeah, it will take almost 6 months or 1 year to reflect that on ground. But wave has started. So
Yeah.
definitely, I'm seeing a lot of momentum in Victoria. So that's great and amazing, Angela. Any questions for me and Puru, Angela?
Well, I mean, you guys are definitely you're in the hot seat when it comes to negotiating for the buyer. I think that's definitely an underrepresented area here in Australia. Buyer agents. I have this conversation with my clients all the time, especially if they're buyers, and they say quite often, oh, but the agent told me X, Y, and Z, and the amount of times where I have to say, but the agent doesn't work for you. The agent works for the seller. The only person that works for the buyer is nobody unless they have a buyer agent. So it's not just about obviously you guys go interstate as well, which is great because not everybody wants to fly interstate to find a property, but yeah, I think from a buyer's perspective, like, are you seeing, like you said, there's a bit of a shift? Are you seeing more and more investors coming back to Victoria? Because we saw a mass exodus, during COVID.
So there are a few markets opening up. So we are closely monitoring this market. So not every suburb, because as we said that we are buying in 15 growth suburbs as we speak in all the states, right? There are 15 growth suburbs. But right now we have started monitoring some of the suburbs in Victoria as well. And in fact, we have started buying in 1 or 2 suburbs as we speak. But for those clients who can wait to see that growth in next after 1 year, 6 months to 1 year, unlike other states. So it's a different, because our strategy, we are not just a buyer's agent. It's based on the strategy which is tailored to the individual circumstances. So people who already have a portfolio, they have they want to minimize their capital risk. They are ready to invest in one property in Victoria. So we are taking them in, but we are setting an impression that, guys, don't look at the graph right now for next 6 months to 1 year, but it will grow up because elections are next year. So government, as you said, that the policies are not for investors, and if government has to come back to win the election, they need to do something. So it's very simple. So Victoria has no genuine reason to lag behind any other state. We deserve better, but that's just the government policies which are putting us back. So as soon as that change, things will start. So we can't promise when it happens. We are not astrologers or numerologists, but we know it will happen one day. It will happen in 1 year. So that's why, to some of the astute investors, they are keen on getting back in Victoria. And I don't see, but not everywhere in Victoria, because it's all about demand and supply. So we know hot pockets where things will grow when Victoria starts booming. So let's hope for the best. And we live in Victoria. I love the state. I love Melbourne. So there's nothing wrong with us. It's just wait for 6 months to 1 year. We'll be back in business. Victoria will be super hot.
Yeah, no, that's good.
And Puru, any?
No, I think.
You guys have any other questions that you want to throw at me?
Yeah, I think we are already at the 1 hour mark, and you have been very gracious to give us the time. The answers were fantastic. And of course, it's a session which will go as a recording back on the group. If you can drop your contact details. So whoever is watching, if you have a convincing need, please, Angela is your person for any residential, commercial sort of purchase in Victoria. And it's on the cards that her business will be expanding northern suburbs. I can't thank you enough. Please keep contributing back to the group, to the community with knowledge sharing and whatever you come through. So it helps our members on this group quite a lot.
Yeah, happy to help. Happy to answer any questions that anyone has offline. Always happy to do that.
Thanks,
Thank you
Angela,
so
for your
much.
time. Have a great evening.
Thanks, guys. You too.
Thank you.
Guru,
Bye-bye.
we need to think about once Anubhav is back from holidays. I think we need to think about ball dance in some of our parties. And Angela is a coach. She has won international awards and she's great at it. So
That will be wonderful. That will be awesome.
Yeah,
all good. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
no worries.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.